"I won't knock twice," I said to the closed door, my voice so calm it startled even me. Rain slid down the collar of my wool coat and gathered at my wrists, cold and persistent, as if the night itself was reminding me how quickly everything can change. Just an hour earlier, I had still believed that blood meant something, that the years I spent building a life brick by brick would earn me at least a place on my own son's couch. The porch light flickered above me, casting weak yellow shadows over the 2 suitcases at my feet. One was scuffed leather I'd carried on business trips across 3 states. The other was brand new, bought in a hurry the morning my accountant whispered the word bankruptcy like it was a diagnosis no one survived. When Ashley opened the door, she didn't look surprised to see me. That was the first sign I should have paid attention to. Her eyes moved from my face to the suitcases, then back again, calculating, polite in the way strangers are polite when they don't intend to help. "Daniel isn't home," she said. Her voice was smooth, practiced. I nodded. I hadn't expected him to be. My son worked late now. He had dinners, conferences, people who needed him. I used to be one of those people. "I can wait," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, as if this were just an unplanned visit on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Somewhere inside the house, I could hear the hum of a television and the clink of glass against granite. It smelled faintly of roasted garlic and expensive candles. Ashley rested one manicured hand against the doorframe, blocking the entrance without making it obvious. "This isn't a good time, Margaret." She never called me Mom. I told myself years ago that modern families were different. That respect came in new forms. That love didn't always sound like it used to. I smiled anyway. Smiling had always been my armor. "My business collapsed this morning," I said, the words landing between us like fragile porcelain. "I just need somewhere to stay for a few days. Until I figure things out." For a brief second, something flickered across her face. Not sympathy. Recognition. As if a long-awaited delivery had finally arrived. She stepped outside, pulling the door almost shut behind her so that only a narrow strip of warm light spilled onto the porch. Rain dotted her silk blouse. She didn't seem to notice. "Daniel and I have talked about boundaries," she said quietly. "We can't take this on right now." Take this on. I wondered when I had become a problem to be managed instead of a mother who once stayed up all night sewing Halloween costumes and balancing payroll at the same kitchen table. My fingers tightened around the handle of my suitcase. The leather creaked in protest. "It's just temporary," I said. I could hear the pleading in my own voice and hated it instantly. Ashley's lips pressed into a thin line. Then she did something small and final. She pushed the door closed. Not violently. Not with drama. Just enough to make the lock click like the end of a sentence. I stood there for a long moment, watching my reflection blur in the rain-streaked glass. The woman staring back at me looked older than 67. Smaller somehow. The porch light flickered again, and the television inside grew louder, as if the house itself were swallowing any trace that I had ever belonged there. I picked up my suitcases and walked back down the stone steps, one careful step at a time. My knees ached from the cold. My chest felt hollow like an office building after everyone has gone home. When I reached my car, I didn't get in right away. I just stood beside it, listening to the steady rhythm of rain on the roof, remembering another sound entirely. The echo of applause in a convention hall 20 years ago, when my company won its first regional award. Back then, Daniel had been in the front row, grinning so wide I thought my heart might burst. I placed the suitcases in the trunk with deliberate care, as if they contained something fragile and irreplaceable. Maybe they did. Maybe it was dignity. Maybe it was the last piece of a life I had built with my own hands. I slid into the driver's seat and watched the house through a veil of water on the windshield. Somewhere behind those bright windows, my son was living a future I had helped pay for. Brick by brick, tuition check by tuition check. I started the engine. The dashboard clock glowed 9:17 p.m. The night stretched ahead of me, long and uncertain. I took a slow breath, wiped the rain from my face, and whispered into the quiet car. "Some doors close so you can finally see who was holding the key." I drove until the streetlights thinned into long stretches of darkness, and the neat rows of suburban homes gave way to empty parking lots and shuttered storefronts that looked like they had given up long before I had. The rain softened to a mist that clung to the windshield like a memory refusing to fade. And I realized I had not eaten since early morning when my accountant sat across from me with his tie loosened and his eyes fixed on the folder between us. Bankruptcy was such a quiet word for something that could dismantle an entire life. It did not sound like the late nights, the missed holidays, the decades of believing that if you worked hard enough the ground beneath your feet would stay solid. I pulled into the far corner of a 24-hour supermarket parking lot and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than the rain. Fluorescent lights buzzed above me, pale and indifferent. A shopping cart rolled slowly across the asphalt, pushed by nothing but the wind. I watched it until it bumped against a curb and stopped, as if even it had found a place to rest before I had. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes, not to cry but to remember. There had been a time when nights like this were filled with purpose. When I would sit at the same wheel, rehearsing presentations in my head, planning expansions, imagining the look on Daniel's face when I told him his college tuition was covered. He used to sit beside me in the passenger seat with his backpack at his feet, asking questions about profit margins like they were riddles we could solve together. Somewhere along the way those conversations turned into polite updates and then into silence. My stomach tightened, a reminder that the body keeps its own schedule no matter how the heart stumbles. I reached into the glove compartment and found a packet of crackers left over from some long-forgotten road trip. They tasted like cardboard and stubbornness. I chewed slowly, watching people come and go beneath the bright supermarket sign, each of them carrying bags full of things they had chosen. I wondered when my own choices had narrowed to this. When did success become something that could vanish overnight, while the memories of building it remained so sharp they almost cut? A security guard in a reflective vest walked past my car and glanced in without really seeing me. I was grateful for that. There is a strange dignity in being invisible when you have lost everything. I adjusted the seat and pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. The fabric still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets I kept in my closet, a small habit from the years when I believed in permanence. I thought of the office again, of the way the late afternoon sun had stretched across the conference table, illuminating dust that had always been there but had never mattered before. My name was still etched in glass on the door. Margaret Collins, founder and chief executive officer. Titles linger longer than the power behind them. I wondered who would peel the letters off when the new owners arrived, and whether they would leave a faint outline like a ghost refusing to move on. My phone buzzed once on the passenger seat. For a moment hope flared so quickly it almost embarrassed me. Perhaps Daniel had called. Perhaps he had come home, seen the empty porch, and remembered the woman who used to wait up for him with warm milk and quiet reassurance after his first heartbreak. The screen lit up with a promotional message from a bank I no longer had an account with. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding and turned the phone face down. Outside, the mist thickened again, turning the world into soft shapes and distant sounds. I thought about driving until dawn, about finding some anonymous motel where no one would ask questions as long as the credit card went through. But something kept me rooted in that parking lot. As if the universe were giving me time to understand the scale of what had ended. I watched the clock on the dashboard tick forward minute by minute. 9:42. 9:43. Time had never moved so loudly. Finally I reached into the back seat and pulled one suitcase forward, resting it beside me like a quiet companion. Inside were neatly folded blouses, framed photographs, a leather notebook, filled with numbers that used to mean growth instead of loss. I ran my hand over the worn handle and felt an unexpected steadiness settle in my chest. Lives collapse. Doors close. But there are always pieces left behind that no one else knows how to use. I sat up straighter, started the engine again, and guided the car out of the empty corner of the lot. Not because I knew exactly where I was going, but because standing still suddenly felt like the only real defeat. I drove toward the part of town where the highway curved along the river, and the streetlights reflected in the dark water like scattered coins no one bothered to collect. The night felt endless, stretched thin between what I had been and what I was becoming. After nearly 20 minutes of driving without direction, I found a small roadside motel with a faded blue sign that flickered every few seconds as if it were trying to decide whether to keep working. I pulled into the gravel lot and sat there with the engine running, watching the front office window glow with a tired kind of warmth. Years ago I would have walked into a place like this with the quiet confidence of someone who had choices. Now I studied it like a stranger studying a language she used to speak fluently. When I finally stepped out of the car, the air smelled like damp asphalt and distant pine trees. My shoes crunched on loose stones as I carried one suitcase at a time toward the office door. A bell chimed overhead when I pushed it open. Behind the counter, a young man in a gray sweatshirt looked up from a crossword puzzle and gave me a polite nod. He did not ask questions. He did not look at my suitcases with curiosity. He simply slid a registration card across the counter and pointed to a pen chained in place like it had nowhere else to be. I signed my name slowly, noticing how steady my handwriting remained even when everything else felt uncertain. Margaret Collins still looked like someone who belonged somewhere. The room he handed me was on the second floor, facing the highway. The carpet was worn but clean, and the lamp beside the bed cast a circle of light that made the space feel temporarily claimed. I set my suitcases down and stood in the center of the room, unsure what to do next. For decades my evenings had been scheduled down to the minute. Conference calls, investor dinners, last-minute revisions to contracts that could determine the future of hundreds of employees. Now there was only silence and the faint hum of trucks passing in the distance. I sat on the edge of the bed and removed my coat, folding it carefully over the back of a chair as if order alone could restore balance. On the small desk near the window lay a notepad stamped with the motel's name. I picked up the pen and stared at the blank page, remembering another desk in another office where Daniel used to sit during summer breaks, swinging his legs and asking if success ever felt heavy. I used to laugh at that question. Success did not feel heavy then. It felt like momentum. It felt like sunrise meetings and late-night victories, like applause that followed you into your dreams. I lay back against the stiff pillows and watched headlights sweep across the ceiling in slow intervals. Each passing car was a reminder that the world did not pause for individual heartbreak. Somewhere, someone was still signing deals, still celebrating promotions, still believing that effort guaranteed security. I closed my eyes and let memories surface one by one, not to torture myself but to understand the shape of what had changed. Ashley's voice at a dinner months ago, light and almost joking as she mentioned retirement communities with manicured lawns and weekly bingo nights. Daniel's quick agreement, his eyes fixed on his phone as if the conversation were background noise he could mute at any time. The way I had smiled and changed the subject, convinced that love could be preserved through patience alone. I rolled onto my side and reached for the leather notebook in my suitcase. Its pages were filled with figures, projections, handwritten reminders from a life that had once demanded constant attention. Tucked between two sheets was a business card I did not remember keeping. The embossed letters caught the lamplight. A law firm I had not spoken to in years. My pulse quickened, not with fear but with something sharper. Possibility does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it waits quietly in forgotten places until you are desperate enough to notice. I sat up and traced the raised ink with my fingertip, feeling the first flicker of clarity break through the exhaustion. Outside, a semi-truck roared past, shaking the thin motel walls. Inside, I inhaled slowly and allowed myself a single measured thought. Perhaps losing everything was only the beginning of discovering what had never truly been taken. I did not sleep that night. I lay on top of the motel blanket fully dressed, watching the thin curtains shift each time a truck passed on the highway, feeling as though the entire world was in motion while I remained pinned between what had ended and what had not yet begun. At some point before dawn I sat up, switched on the bedside lamp, and studied the business card again. The name embossed in quiet authority was one I had trusted during the years when contracts were signed with firm handshakes and futures felt negotiable. Howard Pierce, Senior Partner, Pierce & Caldwell Legal Group. I remembered the last time I had seen him. He had been standing beside me in a crowded conference hall, congratulating me on a merger that had doubled our workforce and nearly tripled our market share. He had called me formidable then. I wondered what he would call me now. Outside, the sky shifted from charcoal to pale gray, revealing the outline of pine trees beyond the parking lot, and the dull shine of a vending machine that had probably been humming there for decades. I rose, smoothed the wrinkles from my blouse, and brewed a cup of bitter motel coffee that tasted like compromise. It was not the worst thing I had swallowed in the past 24 hours. Sitting at the small desk, I opened the leather notebook and began to read my own handwriting as if it belonged to someone else. Numbers from 3 months ago. Projections that assumed stability. A note circled in blue ink that simply read contingency plan. I stared at that phrase until it seemed to glow with quiet accusation. I had always believed I was prepared. That was the story I told my employees, my investors, even my son. Yet when the ground finally shifted beneath me, I had arrived at his door with suitcases instead of strategy. The realization did not wound me. Clarified something. I reached for my phone and hesitated before dialing the number printed on the card. Bride has a way of disguising itself as patience. I had mistaken one for the other more than once in my life. The line rang twice before a calm female voice answered. Pearson Caldwell. How may I direct your call? I almost hung up. Then I pictured the porch light flickering above me, the click of a lock that sounded like dismissal, and I straightened my spine even though no one could see me. This is Margaret Collins. I would like to speak with Mr. Pierce. There was a pause, the soft tapping of keys, and then a shift in tone that suggested recognition. Please hold, Miss Collins. Music filled the silence, something instrumental and politely optimistic. I watched the highway through the window while I waited, counting the seconds not as desperation but as momentum gathering itself. When his voice finally came on the line, it carried the same measured confidence I remembered. Margaret, I was wondering when you might call. His words landed with the precision of a well-aimed question. I did not ask how he knew. Men like Howard Pierce always seemed to know more than they said. We spoke for several minutes, exchanging updates that felt both formal and strangely intimate, like two people acknowledging the end of an era while quietly outlining the next. He did not offer sympathy. He offered information. There are assets you may not have considered liquidating, he said. Agreements that were structured to protect you in precisely this kind of situation. I closed my eyes and felt something inside me shift, not back toward who I had been but forward into someone more deliberate. After we ended the call, I sat very still, absorbing the weight of what he had implied. Outside, morning traffic began to swell, commuters moving with purpose toward offices where their names were still printed on doors. I finished the last sip of cold coffee and reached for my suitcase. The future had not opened its arms to welcome me. It had simply left a narrow path visible in the fog, and for the first time since the lock had clicked behind me, I felt ready to walk it. I checked out of the motel just after 9 in the morning, leaving the key on the chipped laminate counter and walking back into the thin autumn sunlight with a steadiness I did not fully recognize as my own. The air carried the crisp promise of a new season, and for the first time since the collapse of my company, I noticed the simple rhythm of life continuing around me. A delivery truck rumbled past. A woman in running shoes jogged along the sidewalk with quiet determination. Somewhere, a radio played a cheerful morning broadcast that seemed almost defiant in its normalcy. I placed my suitcases in the trunk and paused before closing it, aware that everything I own now fit into that small, contained space. Years ago I would have called that a failure. Now it felt more like clarity. I slid into the driver's seat and reviewed the address Howard Pierce had given me, repeating the street name softly as if committing it to memory would anchor me to a direction. The law firm's office was located downtown in a glass building that reflected the sky in sharp geometric panels. I parked 2 blocks away to give myself time to walk. Each step along the crowded sidewalk felt like a quiet reclamation. I passed familiar storefronts that once catered to clients I entertained during quarterly meetings, cafes where I had signed contracts over expensive lunches, benches where I had rehearsed speeches while watching the river move with patient certainty. When I reached the revolving doors of the building, I hesitated only long enough to smooth my hair and adjust the strap of my handbag. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and ambition. A receptionist guided me to the elevator with the professional warmth reserved for people who might still matter. On the 32nd floor, Howard Pierce greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that revealed nothing but attention. He listened as I outlined the events of the past week, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as though he were examining a puzzle rather than a tragedy. When I finished, he turned a folder toward me with deliberate care. Within it were documents I had signed years ago during a particularly volatile market shift, provisions that established a protective trust and minority holdings in subsidiaries I had long considered peripheral. I read each page slowly, feeling the return of a language I had once spoken fluently. These structures were designed to activate under financial distress, Howard explained. Quiet safeguards. He did not need to tell me that most people never remembered. They existed until it was too late. As I absorbed the implications, images of Ashley's composed expression on the porch surfaced unbidden. The certainty in her voice. The assumption that I had arrived at the end of my usefulness. I felt no anger, only a sharpened sense of perspective. I signed several authorization forms, my pen moving with a confidence that surprised me. Afterward, Howard walked me to the window where the city stretched in every direction, traffic flowing like veins through a living organism that did not care who rose or fell. You still have leverage, Margaret, he said quietly. What you do with it will define the next chapter. I thanked him and left the office with the folder tucked securely under my arm, stepping back into the bright afternoon as though emerging from deep water. Hunger reminded me that I had skipped breakfast. I bought a simple sandwich from a street vendor and ate it on a bench overlooking the river, watching sunlight scatter across the surface like opportunity disguised as ordinary reflection. Across the street, a family laughed together while waiting for a bus, their closeness effortless and unexamined. I wondered briefly whether Daniel had thought of me that morning, whether he had noticed the absence of a missed call or an unreturned message. Then I folded the remaining half of my sandwich into its paper wrapper and placed it carefully in my bag for later. Practical habits have a way of surviving even the most dramatic upheavals. As I rose from the bench and adjusted my coat against the cool breeze, a quiet resolve settled over me, firm as the glass towers rising above the skyline. I was no longer searching for somewhere to stay. I was beginning to remember how to build somewhere to stand. I checked into a modest extended stay hotel on the edge of downtown just before sunset, choosing it not for comfort but for anonymity, the kind of place where people came and went without questions and where the front desk clerk barely glanced up as I signed the register. The room was larger than the motel but still temporary, a neutral space with beige walls and a kitchenette that smelled faintly of lemon cleanser. I placed the folder Howard had given me on the small dining table and stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around me like a decision waiting to be made. Outside the window, traffic moved in steady lines of red and white lights, each car carrying someone toward a destination they believed they deserved. I opened the folder again, reading every clause until the language no longer felt like legal abstraction but like a map. Minority stakes. Deferred dividends. A protective trust activated by insolvency. Pieces of a strategy one had once built for myself, and then forgotten in the daily urgency of success. I made a pot of weak coffee using the machine on the counter and sat down with the leather notebook, drawing columns the way I used to during long nights in my office when the future was still negotiable. Numbers began to take shape again. Timelines. Options. The quiet mathematics of recovery. For the first time since the collapse, my thoughts did not circle around loss but moved forward with cautious intent. My phone buzzed on the table. Daniel's name lit the screen, familiar and strangely distant. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of spite but because I needed to hear his voice without the echo of that closed door. He sounded tired, his words careful as though he were stepping across thin ice. He asked where I was. He said Ashley had been worried. I pictured her composed expression, the way she had stood between me and the warmth of her home, and I realized worry could mean many things. I told him I was safe. I did not offer details. Silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken expectations. Finally he mentioned that he had always assumed I would never need help, that I had built a life too solid to crack. I almost laughed at the innocence of that belief. Instead I said only that foundations can shift when you stop inspecting them. He asked if we could meet. I told him perhaps soon. After we ended the call, I felt neither comforted nor wounded, only aware that a chapter of dependence had quietly closed. I returned to my notes, outlining the sequence Howard had suggested. Contact the investment firm still holding the dormant shares. Review the subsidiary agreements. Arrange a meeting before rumors of my bankruptcy hardened into certainty. Outside, a siren wailed briefly and then faded into the hum of the city, a reminder that urgency belonged to everyone, not just to me. I stood and unpacked my suitcase methodically, hanging each blouse in the small closet, lining up my shoes beneath the rack as if order itself were a promise I intended to keep. In the bathroom mirror my reflection looked steadier than it had the night before, the lines around my eyes less like defeat and more like history. I brushed my hair slowly, remembering mornings when I had prepared for board meetings with the same deliberate calm, knowing that confidence often began as a decision rather than a feeling. Later, I heated a simple meal in the microwave and ate at the narrow table, while reviewing financial statements spread around me like pieces of a puzzle only I could assemble. The extended stay room did not feel like refuge. It felt like a command center stripped of illusion. When darkness finally settled over the city, I switched off the overhead light and stood at the window, watching the reflections of office towers shimmer on the river's surface. Somewhere beyond those lights were opportunities that still carried my fingerprints, ventures that had not yet realized their founder had returned. I pressed my palm lightly against the cool glass and whispered a quiet promise to the woman I had been before comfort dulled her vigilance. Tomorrow would not be about asking for space in someone else's home. Tomorrow would be about reclaiming the ground I once taught myself how to claim. I woke before sunrise with the strange clarity that comes after a decision has been made in the quiet hours of the night, the kind of clarity that does not feel dramatic but steady, like a tide that has finally turned. The extended stay room was still dim, the outlines of furniture softened by early light filtering through the blinds. For a moment I remained still, listening to the distant hum of the city preparing itself for another day of transactions and quiet ambitions. Then I rose, brewed a stronger cup of coffee than the night before, and spread my notes across the small table as if I were laying out blueprints for a structure no one else could yet see. The numbers no longer frightened me. They challenged me. I called the investment firm Howard had mentioned just after 8 o'clock, my voice calm and precise as I introduced myself to a young analyst who sounded surprised to hear my name spoken in the present tense. He placed me on hold, and I watched steam curl from my coffee mug while instrumental music played through the receiver, thinking about how often success depends on timing, rather than talent alone. When he returned, his tone had shifted into careful respect. "Yes, Miss Collins. We have been expecting to review your position." That sentence alone felt like the unlocking of a door no one else knew existed. We arranged a meeting for the following afternoon. After ending the call, I allowed myself a small private smile that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with recognition. I spent the morning organizing documents, sending measured emails, re-entering a professional world that had once been as familiar to me as my own reflection. Around noon I decided to step outside and walk. The autumn air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor, and the faint metallic tang of construction somewhere nearby. I followed the river path without thinking, letting memory guide my steps until the skyline shifted and the boutiques grew more expensive. That was when I saw them. Daniel and Ashley were seated at a corner table beneath the striped awning of a restaurant I used to favor during negotiations, the kind of place where waiters knew your name and never hurried you toward a decision. Ashley was laughing, her hand resting lightly on a glass of white wine that caught the sunlight like a small performance. Daniel leaned forward as she spoke, his posture relaxed in a way I had not seen for years. Between them on the table lay shopping bags from stores whose window displays I had helped finance through sponsorship deals long ago. I stopped walking but did not approach. Instead I stood beside a planter of late-season flowers and watched the quiet choreography of their afternoon. Ashley reached for Daniel's phone, scrolling through something with a satisfied expression that felt familiar in a way I could not immediately place. Then she said something that made him glance around quickly before lowering his voice. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the look of calculation passing between them, the unspoken understanding that comes when people believe their future is secure. I felt no surge of hurt, only an unexpected distance, as if I were observing a scene from a life I had already stepped out of. A waiter delivered their check, and Ashley studied it with casual authority before handing over a sleek credit card. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. The gesture was small, almost invisible, yet it carried the weight of a pattern I had ignored for too long. I turned away before they could notice me, continuing along the river path with measured steps. The city moved around me in bright fragments of sound and motion, but inside I felt an expanding stillness. Information is a form of power, I reminded myself. Observation is its quiet ally. By the time I reached the hotel again, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the glass towers, painting the windows in shades of copper and resolve. I placed my folder on the table, opened my notebook, and wrote a single sentence across a fresh page. They believe the story has ended. Tomorrow I begin to write the next chapter. I arrived at the investment firm the next afternoon 10 minutes early. Not because I feared being late, but because I wanted to experience the quiet authority of walking into a room fully prepared. The lobby was brighter than I remembered. Sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows and settling across polished stone like a silent invitation. I paused only long enough to straighten the sleeve of my blazer before giving my name to the receptionist. Recognition flickered in her eyes the way it often does when a reputation lingers longer than a circumstance. She guided me toward a conference room overlooking the river where a young associate and a senior partner were already waiting with neatly arranged folders and a tray of untouched mineral water. They stood when I entered. Respect is sometimes offered automatically to those who once commanded it. The question is whether you still know how to receive it. We exchanged greetings that were both cordial and strategic. I listened as they outlined the status of the dormant shares and the unexpected resilience of certain subsidiaries that had quietly weathered the market downturn. Their language was cautious, professional, tinged with the subtle curiosity of people wondering whether I had come to surrender or to negotiate. I let them speak until the room felt saturated with numbers and assumptions. Then I began to ask questions. Precise questions. Questions that shifted the tone from condolence to collaboration. By the time the meeting ended, a framework had emerged. Conditional buybacks. Deferred control clauses. A path that did not promise immediate restoration but hinted at something far more valuable. Leverage. I left the building with a folder heavier than the one I had carried in, aware that weight can sometimes signify possibility rather than burden. Outside, the sky had turned a pale autumn blue that made the city appear both fragile and enduring. I walked along the river again, this time not as an observer but as a participant returning to a game she understood better than most. My phone buzzed while I stood watching sunlight scatter across the water. Daniel's name appeared once more. I answered without hesitation. He sounded relieved to hear my voice, as though my continued existence had become a variable he could not comfortably predict. He suggested dinner, a conversation, an opportunity to explain. I agreed to meet him the following evening at a place he chose, a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town where families gathered without spectacle. After ending the call, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, feeling the faint tremor of anticipation that accompanies any approaching confrontation. Not fear, not resentment, something closer to clarity. Later, back in the extended stay room, I spread the new documents across the table beside my earlier notes, aligning them until they formed a coherent sequence. The strategy was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding. I reheated the remaining half of the sandwich from the day before and ate it slowly while reviewing timelines that intersected with surprising elegance. Each line of text represented a choice I could make. Each clause, a quiet answer to the certainty I had seen in Ashley's eyes on that rain-soaked porch. Outside, evening traffic thickened into a restless current of headlights and impatience. I turned off the overhead light and stood at the window, letting the reflection of the city merge with my own. Tomorrow would not be about proving that I had survived. It would be about revealing that I had never truly disappeared from the equation. Somewhere beyond the glow of office towers and restaurant signs, people who had once written me off were continuing their routines, convinced that security was permanent and doors closed remained closed. I rested my hand on the cool glass and felt the steady return of a rhythm I had almost forgotten. The next move would not be loud. It would be deliberate. And it would be mine. The restaurant Daniel had chosen was quieter than I expected, tucked between a bookstore and a florist whose window glowed softly in the early evening light. I arrived a few minutes before the reservation, not out of habit this time but out of curiosity. I wanted to feel the atmosphere before his presence altered it. Inside, low music drifted across polished wooden floors and small tables dressed in white linen. Families spoke in hushed voices. Glassware caught the golden reflections of hanging lamps. It was the kind of place where conversations were meant to be important without appearing dramatic. Daniel was already there when I approached, standing as I reached the table in a gesture that felt both familiar and distant. He looked older than he had just a week ago, as though uncertainty had finally found a way to settle into his posture. We exchanged a brief embrace that carried more history than comfort. Ashley was not with him. I noted her absence without asking. We sat, menus opened and then set aside almost immediately, neither of us particularly interested in food. For a moment we spoke about ordinary things. Traffic, the changing weather, a mutual acquaintance who had moved to another state, small bridges built over a widening gap. Eventually Daniel folded his hands on the table and met my eyes with an expression that tried to be steady. He said he had been shocked to learn about the bankruptcy. He said he had assumed I would call him sooner. I listened without interrupting, watching the faint tremor in his fingers that betrayed a deeper unease. When he mentioned the night I came to his house, his voice faltered. He explained that Ashley had been overwhelmed, that they had been discussing finances, that everything had felt sudden and complicated. I let the explanation settle between us like dust in late sunlight. Then I told him where I had been the past few days. Not every detail, only enough to shift the balance of what he believed. I described the meeting at the investment firm, the dormant shares that had begun to move again, the strategic conversations unfolding behind closed doors. His expression changed slowly, disbelief giving way to something closer, to recognition. He asked if I was planning to rebuild. I answered that rebuilding was only one possibility. Sometimes the wiser path was to restructure the entire landscape. Our meals arrived untouched. A waiter refilled our water glasses with quiet professionalism. Around us, conversations rose and fell like tides that had nothing to do with ours. Daniel leaned forward then, urgency replacing hesitation. He said he wanted to help. He said he had always admired my strength. The words sounded sincere, yet they carried an echo of calculation I had learned to hear. I smiled gently, not in forgiveness and not in rejection, but in understanding. I told him that strength is often invisible until it is tested, that doors close for reasons we only recognize later. When the check arrived, he reached for it automatically. This time I placed my hand over his and slid my own card across the table. The gesture was small, definitive. His eyes widened slightly, not at the payment itself but at what it represented. After dinner we walked outside together. The night air was crisp, scented with fallen leaves and distant rain. Streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, stretching our reflections ahead of us like parallel stories that might never meet again. At the corner we stopped. Daniel asked if he could see me soon. I told him perhaps. Then I stepped away, leaving him standing beneath the soft glow of a florist sign that flickered with quiet persistence. As I walked toward the car, my phone vibrated with a new message from Howard. The first phase had been approved. I paused beneath the darkening sky and allowed myself a single steady breath. Some endings do not arrive with noise or spectacle. They unfold in quiet decisions, in measured steps taken away from what once defined you. I started the engine and drove into the night, aware that the road ahead no longer belonged to anyone else's expectations, but to the deliberate rhythm of my own return.